All right, we're doing a continuation of the goal we set for last week. I covered the history of Iran from 1979 to 1984. This is, of course, the beginning, the overall Iranian revolution. Ruhollah Khomeini becomes the supreme leader. In the aftermath of that, 2 years later, you have Saddam Hussein attempt to become the new strongman of the Middle East by invading Iran, thinking that their forces are weakened from all of the conflicts they've had in the preceding 2 years. They have a ceasefire, or rather, they have a stalemate for most of 1981. And in 1982, the United States becomes involved. In 83, I think it's, let me make sure. There was an attempt at peace or a ceasefire proposal in 82 as well, which included Hussein, or rather Saddam, having one of his people, his health minister, say, "Hey, you could step down, and maybe then we might be able to get a peace deal." And that ended with him taking the guy outside and shooting him with a pistol, and going right back to the meeting like nothing happened. Thank you, Dirk. Um, but again, I just want to have a brief recap of the important points so that we can kind of get into this second part. And it did better than I thought it would do. I was shocked. I usually am getting like 10 or whatever, like 80 people to watch that. Wow. All right. So going into 85, Iran has received financial support from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and other states in the Persian Gulf. In January of that year, Iraq is defeated by Iran. The latter, they launch, so Iran launches an offensive against Baghdad, Basra Highway in March, codenamed Operation Badr, so it's bad with an R at the end of it. Iraq's forces consist of 100,000 troops, with 60,000 more in reserve, and their planning consisted of assessing the marshy terrain, plot points where they could land tanks, and constructing potton bridges across the marshes. So Iran's offensive broke through the Iraqi lines, and on March 14th, the Revolutionary Guard broke through north of Qurna, and the same night, 3,000 Iranian troops crossed the Tigris River using ponton bridges, afterward capturing part of the Baghdad-Basra Highway 8, which was an objective that they previously had mounted during the dawn operations I mentioned in the first part, particularly 5 and 6. There were so many of those things. We actually have a few of them here too. Saddam's response to Iran gaining Baghdad-Basra Highway 8 was to launch chemical attacks against Iran along the highway. And this was coinciding with his initiation of the Second War of the Cities, which is something that was mentioned in the first part as well. And this campaign is against 20 to 30 Iranian population centers, or centuries ready, so cities. By the end of Operation Badr, there were 10,000 to 12,000 Iraqi casualties and 15,000 Iranian casualties. That's a running theme, by the way, that if you look at the individual numbers of a lot of the individual operations, there tends to be a higher number of Iranian casualties, which you can attribute to all of the different countries that are backing Iraq and giving it their superior weaponry, like the US, Saudi Arabia, whatever. That coalition that, to this day is still in effect to some extent. Also, during that year, you get demonstrations in Iran in 74 cities, May of 85, and that's significant because it's the first showing of disillusion with this war by the Iranian people, and that becomes kind of central to a lot of the casualties they'll sustain 3 years later in 88. But the regime in Iran says we're not having that, and they actually go around murdering some of the protesters and shooting other ones, who managed to survive. So in February of 1968, Iran launches Dawn Operation 8, or Operation Dawn 8, which has 30,000 troops proceed in a 2 prolonged offensive to successfully capture the Al-Faw Peninsula in southern Iraq, the only area touching the Persian Gulf. Now, when they do this, they pull this off. It's a major goal of Iran, and it catches Iraq off guard because they thought the Iranians couldn't cross the Shat al-Arab, so they end up surprising them. The following month, Iran makes an unsuccessful attempt to take Khazar. So it's and then Qasr. Again, my pronunciations, I'll freely admit, are not that good. And they failed due to having a shortage of armor. Doesn't work out. And the following month, the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini, the one that came to power during the revolution, issues a fatwa where he declares that the war must be won by March of the following year, so of 87. And this is followed by Iranians increasing their recruitment efforts and obtaining over 600,000 volunteers. They will not have that same level of commitment by Iranian citizens for the remainder of that conflict. So between May and June of that year, the Battle of Meran takes place, where Iraq selects the Iranian city of Meran as its first target in a wave of new offensives, and Iraq offers Meran, after capturing it, to Iran in exchange for giving them back Al-Faw. Now, Iran refuses the deal, and Iraq continues its offensive, though it is pushed back by Iranian AH-1 Cobra helicopters, which destroy Iraq's tanks and vehicles during the conflict. So they say, we're not having that deal. We're going to blow up your stuff, and they do. Iran builds up his forces around Meran and recaptures the city in July. And Iraq's defeat here actually has repercussions for both Iraq and the Western countries supporting it, because it says, hey, look, we have all of these other places backing us, and we're still losing to these guys. In December, Iran launches Operation Karbala 4, which is an assault against the Iraqi island of al-Rasas in the Shat al-Arab River, ending with 60,000 casualties for Iran and 9,000 for Iraq, 9,500. So what, 6 times as many Iranian soldiers die when compared to the numbers lost on the Iraq side. At the beginning of 1987, very few people volunteer for Iran's army, seeing their forces decline. And in response to the large number of draft dodgers that are coming around, they actually have to build up these barricades to stop people from leaving, because it's the way it always is. The people have power when to keep a conflict going, and when one goes on for long enough, as we saw at the Vietnam War in the U.S., a lot of times the civilians revolt against the person who's in the position of power. In July of that year, the UN Security Council passes Resolution 598, which is sponsored by the U.S., and it requests an end to the fighting prior to both countries returning to their boundaries before the war begins. So it says, screw this conflict, go back to the way you were before, essentially, and the U.S. is in support of this. It really shows you the kind of double-sided thing the United States was playing. Oh, we're on Iraq's side, but we're also going to sponsor a resolution telling you to just forget your little war, go back to how you were before. On September 24th, American Navy SEALs capture Iran Air, which is this Iranian mine-laying ship, and it is a diplomatic disaster for the isolated Iranians. And so, not even 2 weeks later, in October, the U.S. Navy destroys 4 Iranian speedboats, and in response to Iranian silkworm missile attacks on Kuwait oil tankers, launches Operation Nimble Archer, which destroys 2 Iranian oil rigs in the Persian Gulf. So this is about as involved as far as troops that the U.S. will get during this conflict. By the end of 87, Iraq possesses 6 times as many tanks as Iran, and 10 times as many fighter aircrafts as Iran. So they have them out artilleried, if that's even a word. Throughout 88, Iraq launches the Trust in God operations, which had one of the largest artillery barrages in history. And Iran at this point puts up very little resistance because the forces are exhausted after years of war. 8 years at this point, actually. Midway through the year, Saddam warns Khomeini, so again, Ruhollah Khomeini, the head of state, with a threat to launch a new and powerful full-scale invasion and to attack Iranian cities with mass destruction-inducing weapons. Shortly after that, the Iraqi aircrafts bombed the Oshaneve, which is an Iranian town, with poison gas, and they kill and wound over 2,000 civilians. So on July 20th of that year, Iran accepts a ceasefire with the adoption of Resolution 598. And then a couple of weeks later, the Iranian Navy fired on a freighter, about a firefighter, and Iraq launches chemical attacks on Iranian civilians, an unknown number of them dying, and over 2,000 being wounded. So there are a couple of more skirmishes that take place. Yeah, Dirk, the Iran was completely overwhelmed. It didn't get the support of any of these countries that Iraq had. And there's actually a thing where there are people, and I was going to get to this later on, but I might as well say it now. There's a thing where even though it's generally agreed at this point that no one won that war, there are those that give Iran credit, or rather declare it the victor, because it wards off an attack from a country that not only didn't have to deal with a military that had just been through a revolution, but also is backed by the US and these other countries that are, all in the tank for one place. So they put up with this stuff. In total, at the end of the war, Iraq loses between 105,000 to 200,000 soldiers, while Iran loses somewhere between 200,000 to 220,000 soldiers. Also, or rather, between 1980 and 2012, you have over 2,000 Iranians die from the war injuries, and over 100,000, so 144,000 Iranian children are orphaned due to the demises of their parents from injuries relating to the war. And a majority of analysis in the West believe the war had no winners, as I just mentioned, Envoy. While there are those that are convinced Iraq was able to pull it, to be the victor, because in that last year, Iran was basically finished, just with dealing with any of this stuff. So it's there's no giant consensus. But notably, Iraq is not recognized as an aggressor, the aggressor of this conflict. Remember, they invaded Iran, which is why any of this started. They're not recognized by the UN Security Council as the aggressor in this war until I think it's about October, late 1991. So that's after the start of the Gulf War, and years after the Iran-Iraq war ends. So this is that, Jesus Christ. Also, I failed to mention, just in because this is important. When Saddam threatened Khomeini with the strike that killed, with the poison gas that killed over 2,000 wounded, either killed or wounded over 2,000 civilians at close to the end of the war, Iranian forces became convinced that the international community didn't care what happened to them. And that made them, wary to keep this thing going, or rather because they knew they didn't have the backing that Iraq was having. So the following year, towards its beginning, head of state Ruhollah Khomeini, calls for the murder of author Salman Rushdie for his novel The Satanic Verses, which he says commits blasphemy against Islam and himself. For what it's worth, Salman Rushdie is still alive. He's 71, so you can tell how well that assassination worked out. And later on, midway through that year, Khomeini dies after suffering a heart attack in late May. On his deathbed, he assembles the group that elects his successor, Ali Khamenei, and that group is the Assembly of Experts. They elect him the day after. Just a little bit of brief background. And this is another case of a stream ending quicker than I thought it would, or rather me running out of content quicker. Ali Khamenei, at the time, he became the supreme leader, which is a more powerful position than the president for those of you, such as myself, who were not familiar with the entirety of the branch of government in these other countries that we don't live in. He previously served as the third president of Iran from 1981 to 1989. And this was after being elected in the aftermath of the assassination of the president before him, Muhammad Ali Rajai, rather. And he also played a leading role in the Iran-Iraq war as a head of state of Iran, even though he wasn't, as big of a deal as Ruhollah Khomeini, which is the case for any president compared to the head of, the supreme leader, and developed close ties with the Revolutionary Guards during that time. Let's see, that must have planted Iran. getting mad with everyone when the UN didn't do anything. Yeah, they. But again, this is you know you see it's so funny. We don't live in any of these places, but so much of this stuff is comparative to each other. You know, when I'm reading the stuff about these anti-war demonstrations that break out in 74 cities, um, I'm immediately reminded of the protest of Vietnam and, you know, obviously Iraq as well in more recent times. But there's this general thing where if a population gets pissed off about, you know, casualties of their own, they're going to revolt to some extent. Except over there, they were way more authoritarian. They kill all these loads of people who were just fed up with it. So I've covered the amount of content I wanted to. I think that next week we'll probably get to the 90s. Will probably be a whole video by itself. It won't be the 5 year thing. It was just that war was such a big deal, but I didn't want to skip it over and not go into most nooks and crannies relating to it. And a lot of times when this stuff is recapped, when you watch a documentary, for example, you don't stuff goes by so quickly that you don't really get to take it in. You know, this conflict is comparable to World War One, and it's just between two countries. But you have hundreds of thousands of people die, and you, as I read earlier, over 100,000 children from Iran orphaned due to the deaths of their parents in this conflict. This 8 year period just destroys so many people's lives, even those that didn't die, all because Saddam wanted to be the new strongman of the Middle East. One of the mistakes I made in the previous installment, however, and I want to correct it now, was I didn't talk about the role that these heads of states play, and kind of what else was going on at that time. Let me see. Dirk says, "Yet with the U.S., we are in a bunch of wars that we fund both sides and no public protest." Well, to be fair, and we've had studies on this. A lot of people are not familiar with these wars, and we've talked about the reasons for that. You know, the mainstream media keeps this stuff hidden; they don't talk about it. For those of you, the four of you that are in here, the three of you that are in here that are not Envoy, that are not Dirk, rather, I get you guys confused sometimes because neither one of you has an avatar. The U.S. is currently bombing Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia. And these stories are not talked. These wars are not discussed with any regularity because the defense contractors own most of our major networks like CNN and Fox News and MSNBC and OAN, or as I like to call it, baby Fox News. So a majority of people, in a lot of cases, even if they know it exists, don't know the extent of it or don't know, for example, how many people have died, how much money we've spent over there. Again, just to give that context. But yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed this, Dirk. I'm trying to enrich myself with information, and I actually was thinking of maybe doing this for other countries, but I do want to go into the what's with the roles, the heads of state that you were going to mention. Oh, okay, yeah, okay, I'll do it. No, I was going to say that when you think of the American president, you think of the person who is the most powerful man in the world, or at least certainly in the U.S. But over there, their president is kind of a second fiddle to the supreme leader, and they've only had two of those, in their history because the first one, Ruhollah Khomeini, died the year after the Iraq-Iran war ended. But he, handpicked his successor, and they both have certain powers that the president doesn't have. Now, I'm trying to see if I can find some material that is comparative of the role, other than just, oh, well, this person's stronger now. It's like, yeah, but how are they stronger? For Khomeini, I was able to get this thing where it mentions that he is, for example, stuff is loading. He controls, so he has the commander in chief controls their armed forces like the American president. can issue decrees and make final decisions on the main policies of government as it relates to the economy, environment, foreign policy, national planning. These are all roles that when you think of a president, in the US anyway, you think of these kind of roles. I'm saying these are played by the supreme leader. And when Khomeini dies, he will be, replaced by another supreme leader, and that person will have power over the presidency. We've had, what is this, 4 presidents under his reign, and none of them have had the amount of power that he has. So that was something I didn't mention, because that's a thing that has to do specifically with Iran's history post 79. They didn't have this before the revolution. As a matter of fact, I want to make sure I get this. I get another thing correct, which is what exact head of state did they have? I think it was just a prime minister. Yeah, and then after the revolution happened, they got rid of that basically. So we don't need that job anymore. No, but I will go into the presidents as well. Just that they haven't played that much. The role of president might as well be thrown away. Yeah, it's like the vice president over here basically. The vice president has no defined role. Sometimes they go on foreign trips and speak to ambassadors and yada yada yada. But aside from occasionally breaking a tie in the Senate, what do they do? And that's exactly what the Iranian president is. You had him, Hassan Rouhani, the current one, go up and talk smack about Trump. But what exactly can he do that the supreme leader cannot? So when you start going into that, you really get an idea of how much weaker that person is. And again, that's something that over here we don't have. Well, you could argue that Congress keeps the president in check, but really that's kind of the thing over there with Khomeini. There's no one keeping him in check. He is this, as the thing says, the supreme leader. And I think a lot of times people don't realize when they think of, if this person becomes president, things will change, that the presidency in the US or in a lot of other countries isn't like being the emperor. You actually have a Congress, especially if they're not from your own party, that keeps that person in check. Over there, you have a person who ascends to a lifetime position, kind of like the US Supreme Court, except they don't have anyone or anything that can get them out of office other than getting killed or dying. Or if they, theoretically choose to retire, which he has shown no interest in doing. He's been in that position for going on 30 years now. But yeah, we've now summed up the entire role of Khomeini. He is, even though his reign is not that long in comparison with Khomeini, he still played a leading role in destroying over 2,000 years of that branch of government that existed in Iran. We don't have a leader of leaders for that reason. Yeah, Dirk. So thank you for checking us out. Next week, I'll try to see if I can do all of the 90s, which will, again, theoretically be simpler. And I'm glad you enjoyed the first part. I just wanted to, keep talking about this stuff because I like learning it. It's very significant. Remember to replay this when you get it. Yeah, we'll see if that happens. Thank Mar, but we're definitely going to do the entire history of that country as it relates to the last century, especially the period of Mohammad Mossadegh getting kicked out by the U.S. CIA, and then also all the way leading up to the Iranian Revolution. That's like 2 decades in one that will eventually be covered. I want to do that after the 90s. So thank you. The winds of change are with us now.